Thank you. Okay, so my first slide is the most important one. Hi. How's your day been?
Good.
Good thumbs up. Yeah? Nicely done. So I want to start off by making my bias in this talk completely clear to all of you. I believe very much that engaging a community of individuals around technology projects makes for better technology projects. And whenever we talk about that, we very much mean tools that make a greater positive social change. And I'm going to spend this time talking about why we believe that, why I believe that, and why and what some of the tools are that you can use to do that. Before I dig in, though, I want to pause for just a second to say, I think sometimes when we start talking about involving a community in developing technology projects, we think of people outside of our offices. You know, we think of technology projects that touch people that don't work for us. But I mean all of them, even the ones where you're putting in a donor CRM, or you're migrating from one email tool to another email tool. The more you engage the people who the technology impacts, the more impactful the technology is going to be. But I also want to dig into this sentence just a little bit and start, whoops, but what does this mean? And I want to start very specifically with breaking out some of the words that sometimes I know that I am sometimes in danger of flinging around without defining very well. And there is a very lovely definition of community for Susan Goldsmith. So I broke every rule about PowerPoint presentations at conferences by putting a whole bunch of words in a not very big font up on the screen. But I think the part that really speaks to me whenever I pull it out is this part. Communities are a group of people, you know, she writes, that don't necessarily get along with each other. They're not friends, they're not family, they're not even coworkers, but they're united by a shared purpose that's bigger than each of them individually. And the second part of the quote that I pulled out, that to build community requires only the ability to see value in others, that only, I think, is so tricky. Because the ability to see value in others can be a very hard thing to do when we're stuck in our own viewpoint and our own desires and our own things that we want. But I believe that genuinely building, community participation requires this big view of community and a willingness to see partners and values in others, whether you agree with them or not. Because ultimately, that's what makes social change happen, right? If we're only building technology projects with people that already agree with us, then likely we're keeping the status quo as it is, no matter which side of the line we're on. So being willing to think more broadly about it brings a diversity of view that makes any technology project inside your organization or outside stronger. The second part is this idea of participation. So I have fairly recently fallen head over heels in love with a dead Brazilian philosopher named Paulo Freire. And one of the things that I love so much about his writing and what he talks about is this idea that true change and transformation happens when we roll up our sleeves and we work together and we're both willing to change. And I have started thinking about, and in my organization we have started thinking a lot about what that means for technology projects, right? And so I looked to try and find a quote from him that really pulled out what I was trying to say here. I mean, he says things like this, right? That knowledge requires this sort of endless curiosity and inquiry, and this willingness to reinvent and reimagine yourselves. And whenever I read this quote, I see so much in common with the way that we're increasingly taught to do technology projects, which is about trying a little bit and learning from it, and then trying a little bit more, and then learning from that, and continuing to move forward. And he also talks a lot about that, how much people trust you as a leader, and we're all leaders, no matter the position in our organization. If we're working on projects and we're working in our community, we're leaders. That the trust that people have in their leaders directly reflects the confidence that you have in them. And so whenever we've tried to take that apart and apply some of that to participation, we've come up with the idea that you bring together a community in the way that we defined it earlier, in participation, and that means genuine dialogue. And a genuine dialogue has to mean that both parties are willing to change. And that, it may not sound right here like I'm talking about technology, but I am. We do exclusively technology projects. And what we found that means is that we have to be willing to go in and take the impact measurement that we had to determine the success of a project and throw it away based on what we learned from the community and what they wanted. And we had to put in place what they said was most valuable. So I'm going to give you an example. We've built a system that's called the Safe Shelter Collaborative that helps survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking more quickly find available shelter. We piloted it for about a year in New Jersey, and we found that we're finding shelter for people on average in about 6 minutes, which is up dramatically from the 2 weeks it was taking them. And we started with this very particular idea of how you had to do that. You know, we wanted all the organizations to list how many available beds they had, so somebody else could quickly find who had the available bed, and everybody would keep it up to date. And in fact, nobody but us thought that was the right idea. What the community thought you should do is send out a small bit of information about the survivor, saying how old they were, what gender they were, what kind of trauma they'd suffered, if they had any specific needs, language skills, things like that. Actually, 12 pieces of information. And let everybody on the receiving end, these shelters that may or may not have space, say, yes, I can help, or no, I can't. So they completely turned the model around, right, and made it centered on the survivor, and that's what made it work. So we had to be willing to throw away all our ideas about what a database was and should be and how these kind of systems worked and should work, and do it in a very different way to get those kinds of results. And I think this happens. We find that it happens mostly because we're willing to work close with a large community of actors, and we're willing to be changed by them. And not just, I think, again, speaking for myself, I know that I can, my inclination can sometimes be, I will train those impulses out of you. I will train you to do it my way, right? I will train you, I will train you, I will train you. But in fact, sometimes it's not that I have to train them. Sometimes that we have to change to accommodate the way that they would like to work. And that means changing our technology and changing our expectations for them, often for the better. The methodology that we use, and there are several methodologies that people can use within technology to do this. The methodology we use, and the one that I'll be talking about the most today, is something called design thinking. And design thinking is often used as a buzzword. How many of you have heard of it and done something with it or participated? Okay. So it can often be a buzzword for how you think about human-centered design. It is a formal methodology and practice that brings people together to find creative and practical solutions to problems. And design thinking processes often look like this one. You know, Stanford's design school has their version of it. MIT has their version of it. This is IDEO's version of design thinking. But they all essentially start with some period of listening, and then iteration with a group of people, and then development, and then some more iteration, and then implementation. And again, I'll be talking about it a little bit more. Our design thinking process looks like this. And I think our real secret sauce is that we've trained small woodland creatures to do technology development. And, but in fact, we have made it a circle and not a line like many of them, because we think it doesn't actually stop because you implement it and people started using it and you start again. And just to briefly outline what we do, and as I said, I think it's representative of most design thinking processes. We start with the opportunity to generate, we start with the step that generates opportunities for technology interventions. It's important for us in the first step that we're not actually trying to come up with an idea yet. We're looking for the sticky thing that the idea can land on, right? We're looking for the problem that people have and are trying to solve in the way that it's aligned with our mission. We then design responses to that. The we that I'm using here is almost always the big inclusive we, not the we like me and my team we. And then again, as a community, we select the solutions and features that work best, build them, There's a little bit less we in the building. Typically, we hunker down and hire people and make things so that we can be confident that they'll work and they'll be delivered and they'll be secure and safe and do all the things that we expect technology to do, and then use them. And what we find is as soon as they start being used, that whole circle starts again. And it starts generating new opportunities. So I was talking about the Safe Shelter Collaborative that helps find shelter for people faster. Once we started finding shelter for people, they needed legal help. Right? They needed to get from where they were to the shelter space. They needed places after they had emergency shelter. They needed case management support. You know, so as soon as you unblock one barrier, you tend to open up another set of possibilities and opportunities. So what I want to spend most of the time, though, talking about today is the why and the how of doing that. So if when we're talking about this idea that community-engaged participatory design makes for better technology projects, and we mean community to be the group of people that we hope to be impacted by the project, and participation means that we're willing for the project to be changed radically, and we're setting up opportunities where we can all learn a lot. Well, how do we do that, and how do we structure it in a way that allows us to actually manage and implement technology projects? Because that's the goal. The goal isn't that we get together and have a great time, though we certainly hope that happens along the way to doing the projects that we're working on. We hope that some parts of it are fun. But the goal is that we do get to these impactful technology projects. So starting with the why. So what we see is doing projects by bringing people together and talking about community is really an opportunity to make community will manifest. So whenever we started talking to domestic violence service providers and anti-trafficking organizations and the individuals within those organizations, what we heard amongst everything that they talked about the need for different and stricter laws, better prosecution. They talked about things like what we've recently seen about people that have been convicted of domestic abuse not being able to purchase guns, for example. You know, so they talked about all these things, but the biggest thing they talked about over and over was the need to get somebody into a safe place so that you could then help them with everything else that they needed, right? And what happened whenever they started talking about that and saying we really want to commit resources to solving that is they were also saying it is intolerable that in our community some people don't have a safe place to sleep because they can't, because their home is not a safe place, right? So that idea of making the community will manifest, and the idea that they were saying out of all the things here, this is the one that we have to work on, had huge value, not just in terms of picking a project that was going to be impactful, but in talking to fundraisers and helping explain why this was a problem and what needed to be done there. And then this method, it explores that community will, but then it also makes it manifest in the form of a project. So we had to start getting very specific about what we meant by shelter. You know? So do we mean by shelter that we're giving them a pointer to the local homeless shelter, which so often happens with men that are domestic violence survivors or human trafficking survivors, because there tend not to be shelters for men? Were we talking about telling them to come up with a safety plan and go to a sibling's house? One of the many things that people use, and they were saying, no, we want a dedicated, safe, private place where they can be secure. Right? So it made them really define what they meant by shelter. And one of the things that was very interesting to me in this process is that people that were working in this area also started talking about sheltering as a verb, not just a noun. So a shelter wasn't just the place that people went, but sheltering was the thing that we were doing for them. Right? So by the time we had a discrete technology project that we could describe, we described the ways in which they wanted to care for people that needed to be cared for. They described the problem. They were able to talk about it independently with their own community, whether it was their own donors or fundraisers or foundations. They were able to use it to turn to the community of people they were helping and say, when we say that we want to shelter, provide shelter, this is what we mean. Right? So it did a lot, that description and that work on it did a lot of good that wasn't just about us defining what a technology project can be. It also allows for emergence. So I was sharing that we had started out in the wrong place on this project, like my organization, right? A bunch of technologists. We'd started out with this really database-y view. We'll keep an inventory of the beds, and then we'll match people to the inventory. And we had to get educated on how that didn't work. And it was because we were doing it in the open and inviting comments that somebody could tell us why we were wrong, right? Rather than us building the technology and learning just because nobody signed up for or ever used it. So doing these projects allows for emergence. It also allows for the emergence of unexpected partners. So the organization that was most valuable to us as we were launching the project that I'm talking about is a small organization in a very rural part of Northern California that I never, ever, ever would have picked off a list. I never would have. I thought it would have needed to be a bigger organization that had more resources, was in a more populated area, had a different kind of experience with technology. But in fact, that wasn't true. What we needed was a passionate executive director that was willing to be extremely honest with us throughout the process of developing this. And again, we wouldn't have done that if we hadn't opened the conversation to that bigger view of community. You know, if we just started by doing research and picking who we thought or who we had relationships with. So it allowed that to emerge. It also offers the opportunity for unexpected solutions to come up. So working with this director, you know, we came up with how we would find shelter. I described that. You send out a small blip of demographic information about the survivor, and other people can say, I can help or I can't help. That doesn't work for her, actually, because she's the only shelter of any kind in her part of Northern California. So the other piece of the Safe Shelter Collaborative is if there's no shelter available at a traditional shelter, it can make my phone buzz, or your phone if you've downloaded an app, and we can pay for a hotel room for the person that needs shelter. And they can put them in a hotel when that's a safe and appropriate thing. Again, if we hadn't built for a process that allowed for a broad community conversation, that solution never would have emerged. It wasn't our bright idea. It was the practice of organizations on the ground, but we had to get to a place where we could uncover and find that and empower and build that with technology. So those are very big whys, because so often when we do, how many of you have been involved in a technology project that does not solve a problem that you have? Right? Which is what we were in danger of doing for them, because organizations, the technology project that we would have designed for them would have advertised the empty bed to every other organization in their vicinity, so all of a sudden they would have had 10 people showing up for that one empty bed. We were creating a worse problem for them. We weren't solving a problem they had. The problem they had was never filling their bed. The problem they always had was, how do I help a person whenever there isn't a bed available? And doing these kind of projects as a community allows the real problems that people have to emerge. So I'll give you another example of that, this time from an internal technology project. How many of you have a CRM that you just really love and use all of the time? Yeah? That's great. And were you involved? I'm curious, were you involved in the selection and implementation? No? What we see a lot is that people don't want to use, they don't want to put when they want the CRM is when they have to find out if somebody else has talked to someone. Right? I want to know if Peggy's talked to someone, so I want to go look it up in the CRM. But it doesn't help me track my stuff because, frankly, the search function in Outlook is great. I can figure out if I've talked to somebody. It's when we start thinking about it as the organization. And so a lot of the times we've seen CRM projects fail because they're only valuable to me when I want somebody else's information. But nobody ever puts their own info in there. They never put their own contacts in there. They never put their own things in there. We've seen that when we bring people together, even inside our own organization, to find the common problem that the CRM solves, that we get a lot better results. And for us, what we found, the common problem was not, have you talked to this person or did you do this person? Did you do this thing? But we found the common problem was that our staff didn't want to write original emails. They wanted to crib other people's emails. So I know you've already talked to somebody and told them about TechSoup. I want to go and be able to cut and paste what you've said and drop it into my own email. And so when we started framing the CRM as a way for them to more easily do what they thought of as their problem, they were on board. Same project, same tool. We just framed it in a way that let them see themselves in the solution. So it's true even for, and I will say we put in different features as a result. We made the tagging work a little bit differently, and the way that we organized the information was a little bit different so that people could more easily create snippets out of emails that other people sent. So I think this is true even whenever it's true in smaller ways or in internal projects. We also have found, certainly inside an organization, unexpected champions of a project. Just like the champion of the Safe Shelter Collaborative was not somebody I would have picked. The person that ended up being most passionate about the organization using the CRM never would have been somebody I would have picked off the list. And I worked at TechSoup for 16 years. I know the employee base pretty well. Like, it's just never who I would have said, this is going to be the biggest advocate for this technology project. So it also allows those kinds of things to happen inside your organization, which have a lot of power. So how do you do that? If the benefits to creating this are that you allow better solutions to emerge, you end up with unexpected partners and allies, you can end up with unexpected advocates and champions, how actually do you do it? As I said, we used a design thinking process. You can find a lot of writing on that. IDEO's got some great books on it. I will say that for most nonprofit organizations, the Gates Foundation funded IDEO to write a design thinking for libraries book, and while it's specified towards libraries, I think they do a great job of breaking the process down and providing very specific worksheets, and it's super applicable to nonprofits. They've also done one, a similar thing, design thinking for schools, a little bit less applicable, I think, because they're inside a larger institution and have different sets of constraints, but also a terrific guide. So I'm going to go through how we implement the first of this. The first thing we do is identify the themes. So when I say themes, we may know that we're working in the area. We had a grant to work with domestic violence service organizations or anti-trafficking organizations, but that's still a really giant bucket. What were we working with them to do? You know? And so we had to go through and identify the places that we thought technology could be most helpful. Things like finding shelter, helping do outreach in some instances, you know, and some of the other things. So we got to a greater degree of specificity than that big problem. The same thing's true for internal projects. You know, if you want to put in a CRM, to use that example, you know, why are you putting it in? What problem are you solving inside your organization with the CRM? It's probably not as simple as a giant database of everybody you've contacted. There's probably something that's more specific that's driving you to make the technology investment, whether it's you know, the reason that we were doing it is we were losing contact with people that were valuable to us because we didn't know we had a relationship with them. And in our case, it was less likely that they were valuable as an individual donor, but more valuable in making connections for us within the community. So we were just losing them in the individual emails of people. And you know, there were two effects of that. One is losing them completely. The other one is 20 of us sending them an email because we didn't know that we had, you know, talked to them before. And those 20 emails were all different because we weren't using similar copy and may not have been asking for the same thing. So whether you're doing internal or external projects, going through and really getting more specific about what the theme is, this doesn't quite look like a problem statement yet, but it says what area are we working on, because it's probably not something it shouldn't be. I would advocate that it is not something big and giant and all encompassing, right? But it is something narrower from which you grow. So to use the Safe Shelter Collaborative example, the narrow place was finding shelter. That is what we were laser focused on. We knew people needed transportation to the shelter. We knew they needed clothes at the shelter. We knew all of those things. We weren't trying to solve every problem they had. We were trying to solve that problem. And then we trusted we could grow from there. With our CRM project, we were trying to get everybody to get their individual emails into a common database. That was the problem we were having because the organization was losing out on relationships and they were staying with individuals. So that was the problem that we were solving. And that's how we got into the themes. And then you have to know what your constraints are. I think it's super important once you've identified the area that you are working in with some degree of specificity to know why it has not been solved. Right? Why was it hard for people to get shelter for human trafficking and domestic violence survivors? Why had a technology organization that had 200 employees and been around at that point in time for 25 years, why did we not have a CRM? You know, what was difficult about it? When we do this step, we actually make people write them down on sticky notes and put them on the table. And we give them some rules, like you're never allowed to say time or money, because we know there is not enough time and there is not enough money. You have to say what you'd spend the time on and what you'd spend the money for. But we have people write them down on individual sticky notes and then share them with each other and start to organize them and put them together. We spend a lot of time doing this. And I will tell you for a couple of reasons. One, it's just really valuable, especially if we're coming in somewhat fresh to a project. It's really valuable to learn what people see as hard about it, you know, and where the sticking points are. But there's another part that I have learned is super valuable about this. You know, when you're doing a project of any kind, and there's one person throughout the project, sometimes there's two, or sometimes there's 1,256 people throughout the project that are sort of sitting there with their arms crossed and say, well, we tried this in 1984. Here's why it didn't work. And then 2 weeks later, somebody's saying, and we tried this part, and here's why it didn't work. You can try that, but it's not going to work. And your project gets peppered with bumping into these. We get them all out early. Put them all down. Let's not pretend like they're not there. We know it's a hard problem. But let's get them out, let's organize them, let's know what our constraints are, and then let's set them aside and do the project anyway. Let's not let that it's hard stop us. You know, let's figure out if those are the things that were hard, how do we acknowledge them and put things in place and do the project anyway? And I think that turning point can make those individuals that have often been in the field the longest, probably have the greatest frontline experience, have seen a lot of failed technology projects. It helps put their knowledge to use in creating a technology project rather than putting them in a position where they feel like they're a blocker and you feel like they're a blocker and you end up being adversarial. You know, and it can really change the project. And this is part of the project I described with the domestic violence and human trafficking survivors. This is part of what changed this to focus on sending out the demographic information or finding hotel rooms. Because people were telling us the hard part is not whenever there's how to get somebody into an empty shelter bed. Or asking in my community, because frankly, I can find out how many empty shelter beds there are in my community by turning around. Because I'm the only shelter. The hard part is what I do whenever I'm worried somebody's going to get killed and I can't put them in mine. What do I do? And so it lets you start going, okay, if that's the hard part, then let's run towards the hard problem instead of what we so often do is go, oh, that is hard, and we pull back and get a little bit more conservative in our imagining. And whenever you start to think that way, when you start to set it aside, and this is an important part of design thinking, you start to give yourself permission to imagine the impossible. Because if you don't get those constraints out, if you don't acknowledge what's hard and say, okay, we're going to do something that responds to them and acknowledges them, it doesn't give you the ability to imagine the impossible. And I want to talk a little bit about this picture. I'm looking at it too, but behind you guys. A little bit about this picture. I love this story, actually. So this is this clown, this mime, is on the streets in Colombia, Bogota, Colombia. Do any of you know this story about the mimes they hired? Oh, wonderful. There's this huge problem with pedestrian deaths in Bogota, Colombia. They get this mayor in, he starts working with his team on what they can do to fix the problem of pedestrian deaths. And they decide they're going to hire mimes to stand on the street corner and stop people when they try to walk into the street under dangerous situations. Help them cross the street safely whenever the lights have changed and you should cross the street. I love this idea, and it worked. It worked so well, they started doing it in other cities. They started doing it in Caracas in Venezuela with the mimes. The Brazilians put their own twist on it, and in Sao Paulo, they would hug people that were going to cross against a light or dangerously, you know? And what I love about this particular instance is imagining if you said, without going through a process where we said, we know it's hard, we're going to identify the constraints, some version of, right? And we're going to be willing to imagine the impossible. You would never end up with the chief of police writing a check to clowns for public safety. You would never end up with a city board that said, yeah, we vote in favor of putting this into the budget. Like if you just started there, if you just said, hey, we haven't talked about this at all, let's hire some clowns, police chief, to reduce pedestrian deaths. You could not have not had some kind of process and end up there. But in fact, they did end up in a place that seems bizarre to think about. At the time that he did this, we would have, most of the headlines we would have seen about Colombia would have had to do with drug murders. You know? And so it's just this ability to do that lets you get to these places and lets you get to these kind of solutions that extend yourself. And again, I think that's true whether it is an internal project or an external project. You know, internally, we were with the CRM, you know, we were really thinking that we were about creating a contact database. Like, who are they, where are they, and when was the last time they received an email? We did not think we were creating a knowledge management system for our employees so they could better describe the work that we're doing to people they had met at conferences. But that's what they thought we were doing. And so we ended up doing something different with the tool sets. Maybe if we'd had people dressed up as clowns while doing the training, we also would have. So once you get to a spot where you've done that, and the way we imagine the impossible is, it has to do a lot with sticky notes again. I swear design thinking was actually invented by the people for 3M sometimes. But we actually have people write down the ideas. And actually, let me jump back here, because an important point in this is that these kind of ideas, these kind of impactful ideas that are very different, there's a bell curve when you're doing a brainstorming session, right? People are quiet, quiet, quiet. They start coming up with a bunch of ideas, large quantity of ideas. The ideas get super goofy, and people tend to stop. Somebody in the meeting goes, okay, I think we've hit it. We're at critical mass. Nothing we're coming up is good. And they pull back and they stop. What a study from Stanford showed is the best ideas happen there after most people stop the brainstorming session. They happen well after the ideas start slowing down. That you need those bad ideas that are making weird and forced connections to get to something that's different and good. So I would just, when we do these, again, we have people do a lot of ideation and we have them really focus on quantity. We don't do it in the way of a traditional brainstorming session where somebody stands up and writes it on a bunch of flip charts. And you have the rules like nobody's allowed to criticize an idea, you know those. We don't do it like that. We have people do it individually. So they're writing their ideas down and then share it as a group. And then we start adding to that pile out loud as a group. But we really, really go after quantity. And then, you know, you can, and it depends on the culture of the organization, use a variety of processes to hone down which idea you want to go after. One of the things that we do is ask people to put the sticky notes on top of each other if they're the same idea, right? So you start to get an idea of like a little bit of a heat map. And then we use good old-fashioned dot voting. And we use it an awful lot to end up with the idea that we're going to work on. And at this point in time, what you have is a really concrete description of we're going to find shelter for domestic violence survivors by using, when we started, we were saying by using an Uber-like model where we send out information about the person who needs support and then getting them funded to stay in a hotel room if no shelter exists. So it took us through this process to get to that kind of sentence, and still that doesn't get to a depth of description. And then the next thing is developing a concept map. This is another thing that is super Googleable or Bingable or your search engine of choiceable. But a concept map is a pretty well-traveled way of describing a project before you get going. Again, you're not writing a lot about technology exactly here. What you are saying is, here's what my user looks like, and describing them with a degree of specificity. Are they somebody inside your organization? Are they outside your organization? What's their access to technology look like? You're describing them with a degree of specificity. What problem are we solving for that person? It's really important. As a nonprofit recipient of grants, I've frequently been in the situation where I'm entering data into a database that is solving no problem I have, except that I need money, and that entering that information in that database was a requirement of me getting the money. The problem I'm solving is somebody else's, who wants data about a particular thing, and that means I'm really careless with the data I enter. I don't necessarily want to be. It's just not solving a problem for me, and so I'm doing it as fast as I can. As soon as it's also solving a problem for me, I get much more careful with what I put in there. So you're describing the problem that you're solving for that user, and then you're describing how they're going to find out about the solution. This is an important step that we often miss. If it's an internal project, are they finding out about it because they're getting an email from the person that runs the organization saying everybody has to use this new solution? Are they finding out about it because they're invited to a meeting and doing a training? But how are they supposed to know they're supposed to start using and doing this? What we found is one of the things that we were doing in our organization was sometimes putting things in employee manuals so new employees were learning about it, existing weren't. So because it became linked to onboarding processes, so there would be changes of practice that existing employees didn't know about. So making sure that you know how they're going to know about it. What do they have to do to start using it? Do they have to sign up and have an account? A lot of timekeeping systems work that way, right? You can't go from being told you're going to keep your time there to just keeping your time there. As an individual employee, you have to sign up, have an account. In our timekeeping system, some person that I don't even know who they are, actually, it's an admin, has to associate you with projects so that you can put your time against certain projects. So all these things have to happen before I can ever actually even use the system. Have you identified what those are and communicated them adequately? Again, your degree of specificity on this is going to depend on where you are in the actual development process. If you expect people to be using an app to find services, how are they going to find out about the app? Where are they going to download it? How are they going to get it onto their phone? Do they have to sign up for an account to have it? All of those kinds of things. What does their actual use look like? So I said with the Safe Shelter Collaborative that one of the features that it has is that it could set, my phone could receive a notification and then I could pay for a hotel room for somebody in need. Well, that depends on the fact that I have the notifications on my phone on. Right? Also, sort of non-obviously, almost nobody's getting notifications anymore between 10 p.m. and 8 a.m. because so many people set their phones on Do Not Disturb. So any notification that comes in after hours doesn't. You have to, so you have to think about what does their usage look like? What does it look like on an ongoing basis? What impact do you want it to have on them? And then how are they going to share and talk about it and become an advocate for it? And those concept maps can be really general. They can be of your idea. But going through and taking the time to elaborate on each one helps you do a super important thing, which is figure out what in there you think is going to be hardest and you need to test. So I'm going to give you an example of this from something I think is a terrific thing this group did that's outside of ours, a story that we heard. So a group of developers, a Code for America group of developers were making an application. they were trying to get more people to sign up for food assistance. And they were trying to get to people that were hard to reach, that weren't typically signing up. So they knew, so when they looked at their concept map, that how do you use it, how do we reach them, was the part that they had to test. And they decided they were going to test reaching people on Facebook ads, by using Facebook ads, right? Because they knew people walking in to certain stores or going into social services at organizations or being supported at nonprofit organizations, those people already knew about food assistance. They had a lot of things around them telling them about it. They wanted to get people that weren't going into those places. So they ran Facebook ads. But what they were worried about is, will people really put in this very personal information into Facebook ads? Stuff like about how much I make and that I need, like, am I really going to look at an ad on Facebook when I'm like posting a picture of my kid and click that button and put in this, you know, pretty sensitive personal information? So they determined when they did their concept map that that's what they had to test. So the way they tested it was they bought ads and they made a Google form. And they had people click on the ad and fill out the information on the Google form. Every time somebody filled out a Google form, they hit print, and then somebody sat there and hand wrote it on the food assistance form and mailed it in. Because they didn't want to do all the work to check, and I was so brilliant, because they didn't want to do all the work to connect the back ends of these systems and all the expense if nobody was ever going to put their data in. So they just did enough technology to test that first part of their concept, and then once they knew that people would click on that and add it, then they built the stuff that made it automatic. You know, so they ran a really limited test, you know, testing that first part. And they've asked when we share this story not to share their name, because they assure they broke several privacy laws in the way that they did it. And so I think that is also a very real consideration. People did not necessarily know, even though they said it, they're worried that their disclosure that a human being was looking at the information and transposing it by hand was not as clear as it should have or could have been. So I think that is something to think about when you're doing these tests. You don't want to mislead anybody, right, as to what's happening. But that idea, because they could have gone at it a different direction and decided the hard part was the technical integration and spend all this time building this back-end technology to talk to each other when nobody would ever in a million years click on that ad and fill out the information. What we discovered in the project that I keep talking about finding shelter for domestic violence and human trafficking survivors, what we found out the really difficult part was getting the organizations to be willing to ask for money to cover hotel rooms. I never would have guessed that was the hardest part, but when we went through and looking at it, getting them to do it was hard, because they were so used to reaching into their pocket for their own credit card. And that's such a fast response that getting them to do that and wait to see if somebody was going to answer was really, really hard. They also, just because we as a sector have such a scarcity mentality, they would go, well, this person really needs it, but maybe later tonight somebody will need it more. So they wanted to save our ask because they had this scarcity mentality. And so what we had to work with them to test was what the tolerance was for sending out these requests and how fast donors were able to respond. And we had to give them feedback that donors wanted to respond. You know, so we had to build a lot of that in, and we never would have learned that without a very small test where we had people asking in a pretty manual way at first. They actually contacted us, and we'd send the information out to help determine that. But you have to determine what you need to test, and then you have to build a prototype to test that thing. And this is harder than it sounds. We've seen a lot of communities where their first prototype, so many of you are just familiar with what a prototype is and know? So a prototype is essentially not what you expect to be. It's like if I was building a prototype for a table, I might take these 2 chairs and put a piece of wood across it and then see if that was a comfortable height for people. I don't expect that to be a table forever or to have any solidity or stability, but it's enough to meet my purpose to see if that's going to work, right, in that place or not. And so we have found that prototypes in all kinds of ways work. We do them at a whole bunch of different levels in development. We're big users of paper prototypes, so we'll make big posters of apps and app screens. We've found that the hardest thing about building an app is getting somebody to put it on their phone. Absolutely, positively, that's the hardest part. So we build a prototype of the App Store entry and put them up in places like libraries and ask people, would you put this on your phone? Because if we don't get that part right, nothing else is going to happen. We can build all the technology we want, but if we don't get that page right, the technology is going to be worthless. So we spend a lot of time getting that outreach information right. On internal projects, we spend a lot of time seeing if people on the internal part of the Safe Shelter Collaborative, because for the organizations that are using it, it's an internal data management tool, right? We did a lot of work with them to minimize the number of buttons they had to see and the amount of information that they had to look at. You know, so we did a lot of testing with them to see what are the three, if we only gave you 3 pieces of information, is that enough to make a decision? So that it could be super, super fast and seamless for those organizations. And then anytime we built a prototype, we looked at it and said, how do we do this even cheaper? So that we could drive the prototypes to be as inexpensive as humanly possible. Because our big fear is we're going to spend a lot of money on a really, 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 really bad idea that never in a million years would have worked. If we had not checked it someplace, and we could have checked it someplace simple first. We've also found, just as a side effect, that one of the benefits of building prototypes is people inevitably pop up and say, hey, there's something like that that does this. And we find great solutions that already exist, and we're able to either incorporate them or just step aside and advocate for their use. So that's the other side effect, is that sometimes it just short circuits the entire need that we have. And then you have to be prepared to start all over again. Because once you have gone through this process where you've developed a concept map, you figured out what was important for you to test, you built a prototype and got the responses, usually what happens is you refine and detail your concept map. You build out some technology and something that looks more like a version 1. And then you start, but then you have to do the process all over again, right? Like, what does that mean for the next thing that you have to build? And sometimes it's just adding features to what you've made, but sometimes it's building out more sets to your technology solution. So we've found that to be true even more with internal projects than external projects, that you have to be prepared to loop around and constantly restart and add new features. Because those users, once they start adopting, they're hungry, they're close to you, and they typically want more, and they can start to picture how they use it, so they can be real advocates for change and additional work. Okay, so here's a big finish. Are you ready?